Okay, and you just gotta, keep the microphone close. All right, we're gonna get started. Here comes some.
This is not on. Oh, yes, it is.
Okay, now we got our water supply.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I'm delighted to welcome back Mike Stonebraker. Mike Stonebraker and I worked closely together when we were here. Early in my career, Mike always gave great advice. Sometimes I foolishly didn't listen to it, but he always gave great advice. So I'm really delighted that he's come back. And I think you were here kind of officially almost 30 years. But so you grew up in New Hampshire, right?
Yeah.
And I remember you went to a private high school or something like that. Is that right?
All true.
And did you have siblings?
Wow. No one asks about ancient history.
I do.
but sure, I grew up in rural New Hampshire in the middle of nowhere.
Oh.
And my mother got sick and died. She wanted to live in New Hampshire. She got sick and died.
I didn't know that.
And we moved back to suburban Boston, where my father chose to live in a community that didn't have its own high school, but would pay the tuition of anybody who lived in the town, who could get into one of the posh Eastern prep schools. So we couldn't afford it, but I got to go. So I got to go to a great school, compliments of the town.
So the town paid for that instead of having a high school.
Yeah. But on the flip side, this was an all male school, and it was in the English boarding school tradition where you had to wear a coat and tie and address the teachers as sir.
Wow.
And so socially, it was disastrous because as a day boy, because we couldn't possibly have afforded the boarding school tuition, which the town wouldn't pay. So to the townies, we were the preppies, and to the boarders, we were the day boys. So
you were on the out crowd no matter where you were.
Exactly.
Given you were tall, were you forced to play basketball, or they didn't have athletic teams?
No, you had compulsory sports.
Compulsory sports.
And no math club, no art program, none of that stuff. So I didn't fit in very well.
None of that soft stuff. And so you went from there to Princeton. Was that was that the normal path, or?
So I at the time I was at the top of the my high school class, so I could go pretty much anywhere. And my key thing was to get out of Dodge.
To get away from Boston.
Yeah. And for reasons that don't make any sense in retrospect, I went to Princeton, which at the time was an all-male school. Oh. which was, from an all-male high school to an all-male college was pretty stupid. So I think when I graduated from Princeton, I sort of had the social maturity of probably a 10th grader.
Okay, and then you decided to go to graduate school.
But then the big thing, I think besides getting to go to a good high school, because in rural New Hampshire the schools were absolutely terrible at the time. So I got to go to a good high school, and that got me into Princeton. And then when I graduated from Princeton, since I'm old, the Vietnam War was going full bore, and I had exactly the following options when I got out of college. I could get drafted and go to Vietnam and fight. I could leave the country and go to Canada. I could go to jail, because if you declined the draft, that's where you went. Or I could go to graduate school. Because they were still giving deferments for grad school.
Yeah, I graduated about 4 years after Mike, and that went away by then.
So I'm not that stupid. So, so that's the only reason. And then once you get into graduate school, the minute you don't make normal progress toward the degree that you entered, then your draft board comes knocking and you get to go to Vietnam. So it was huge motivation to get a PhD.
And for those of us who are undergraduates, you know how people graduate in 4.5, 5.5 years undergrads. No men in the Vietnam era didn't graduate in 4 years, because if you got behind, you got drafted and go to Vietnam.
So I mean, you guys are so fortunate that you have control of your own destiny.
Yeah.
And when I graduated from Princeton, I had no idea what I wanted to do. No idea whatsoever. And what I really wanted to do, you guys probably have no idea what the television show Route 66. How many of you have ever heard of this? So that sort of says you're old. So anyway, it's
you watched old television.
yeah. So this is two guys in a Corvette who drive around the United States and have these wonderful experiences. So that's what I wanted to do. But you know, that wasn't in the list of approved things.
You didn't get a drafting permit.
That's right.
Drafting permit to drive around a Corvette. And so, how did you pick Michigan, and what did you study in Michigan? Because computer science was still nascent.
So I applied to Stanford, Berkeley, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and Michigan offered me the best fellowship. I would have had to have TA'd at Berkeley. And so I was totally bought off by money.
But it was computer science that you applied to?
So at the time, there were two computer science departments at Michigan. There was, I mean, similar to what was here a long time ago. So there was one in electrical engineering and one in letters and science. And so I was in the one that was in electrical engineering. And this was back when there was essentially no computer science. So anybody could just say, I'm a computer scientist. And that's pretty much what I did.
But given that you had no plans as a Princeton student, well, I actually didn't ask. What did you study at Princeton? What was your major?
Electrical engineering.
Oh, it was electrical engineering. So it made sense if you're going to go to grad school to go electrical engineering. So.
Well, I mean, I was in the position where I had an 800 on the college boards in math and a 550 on the college boards in English. So it's like, you know, I'm not that stupid.
Okay. And so so then you graduate and you apply for jobs. Did you apply for industry as well as universities?
No, I applied for university jobs. So I get to be 26, and the Army doesn't want me anymore. So I'm finally free, and I get a PhD. And so my PhD thesis is ridiculous. I mean, don't anyone ever go look at it. It's horrible. And so I get a PhD, and I realize that the first thing I have to do is choose something else to be an assistant professor about. And so for reasons that I can't fathom, Berkeley hired me. And of course, you take the best academic job that you get. And so I came to Berkeley, ostensibly, you know, at the time there was an NSF program called Research Applied to the National Needs. And this was Rand Corporation citing firehouses and all that kind of stuff. So I said, sure. Berkeley said, we want to get into this. So I said, sure, I can do sort of applied operations research, which is kind of what my thesis was about. And so I'm an assistant professor at Berkeley, and just like now, you get 5 years to become famous, and if you don't, they fire you. And so I'm here at Berkeley in my first year, and I'm saying, God, what am I going to do? So Gene Wang, bless his heart,
Who's sitting right here.
took me under his wing and said, you know, there's this new stuff called relational databases.
So it was Gene's idea. Gene brought you the idea.
Yeah.
Oh, I wondered how that happened.
Do you remember it that way, Gene?
Well, I can hand you the microphone. I will hand you the microphone. So there was Ted Codd at IBM San Jose comes up with a relational model and talks about it.
And I said to Mike, I said, let's go see Ted in San Jose. You know, it's a short drive away, so we did. And that was the beginning of it. He had a famous paper on relational data. It was a very, very lucid paper. And so I said to Mike, let's do something. Let's build something. And so Mike's probably coming to that. But the catalyst was actually a Guggenheim grant to Berkeley for buying some equipment. And that money wasn't being used. Had been sitting around for several years. It was just enough for us to get the low end, what was it, a PDP-11 45, I think it was the smallest computer that would run Unix, and the PDP-11 45. So we had just enough money to get that, and that was the catalyst.
Well, it was total serendipity, because Ted Codd wrote this pioneering paper in 1970, which you should all read, but it's terribly written.
Historically important.
And so immediately the nascent database community broke into two factions. The first faction was, wow, we can understand, Ted Codd is a genius. He's figured out the way things ought to be. And then there was a bunch of practitioners who said, this newfangled relational languages are too complicated. No one can understand them. And even if you can understand them, you can't build this stuff efficiently. And so it seemed like a no-brainer, which was Gene's idea. Let's build a relational database system. And so at the time at Berkeley, the only computing was on a batch, punch card system, CDC 6400.
Which is a supercomputer, kind of.
And there was no possibility we could build an interactive system on the campus computing center. So as Gene said, he rustled up the money to buy a PDP-11, and we were the first non-Bell Labs user of Unix.
You were the first?
We were first, I think.
First.
I'm pretty sure.
So Ken Thompson, another Turing Laureate, who
is a Berkeley alumni.
Berkeley alumni, got his master's degree here, and there's a story about Ken getting here, that early camp. He goes to Bell Labs, and he and Ken Ritchie, Dennis Ritchie invent Unix, and so he comes back and spends a year at Berkeley.
Well, we decided to run Unix.
And then you recruited him?
And so the first thing is we got him to come out for a week and walk through the source code. And then Gene had the idea, well, let's just invite him to come for a year. And so we did, and he came. And
yeah, that's... and so, how important is Unix? So my good friend and former faculty member, John Ousterhout, who's a great programmer, he's just written a book about how to write software well. He considers Unix, the greatest piece of software ever invented. And that source code is like, I know, the Old Testament. Like, everybody should read that source code and learn how to great software.
And it's only about that thick. Line printer paper.
Well, so they may not know what that means. That's pieces of paper a little bit wider than this, that thick. So I don't know, it's 150 pages or 200 pages, yeah. So it's a brilliant piece of software. So it was a fortuitous choice well, how did you know Unix was, because you needed it to be interactive?
Right.
It was free? It was free. And then it would run on PDP-11. The PDP-11 45 is one of the most successful so-called mini computers. So these would be like one rack of equipment, when the supercomputer in the basement of Evans Hall would be a big computer with many racks of equipment, and cost probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. And probably the PDP 1145 was like $25,000 or something like that.
No, it's over $100,000.
$100,000. Wow.
And so we either had, it was either Unix or RSX-11, which you've probably all never heard of, but it's sort of DEC's real-time system. You take a look at both systems and you say, RSX-11 cannot possibly be the right answer. But in retrospect, I mean, we were completely crazy because we were user number one outside of Bell Labs of this untested operating system, and it could have been a disaster. I mean, it worked beautifully. I mean, it was really a good piece of software. And,
Disaster would have meant Stonebraker not getting tenure.
Yeah. Gene Wong had tenure, so it would have been inconvenient for Gene Wong. It was a disaster for Mike.
But I say that was one of, I think, there were a bunch of serendipitous events that I think, we're not, we didn't really think about this, we just sort of said this has to be a good idea, and
You mean relational databases?
no, the Unix.
Unix, okay.
And then we're just going to build a database system. Neither Gene nor I had ever written system software before. So we just said, how hard can this be? We just started doing it. and I think one piece of advice to all of you is, just do it. And you all analyze the crap out of all these situations. Wow, am I going to succeed? Should I be doing something else? Just do it. We just didn't think about it. We just did it, and it was certainly an adventuresome path. But it worked. I say it certainly worked out for me.
Yeah, I'd say so. So you hadn't done any systems programming. So what was the mix of people who worked on that first project, which was called Ingress for Interactive Graphics and Retrieval System?
Well, I think we had a huge advantage, which is at the time on campus, we had the only interactive system around. And so you could either submit punch cards in the basement of Campbell, or you could come work on terminals with an interactive system. So we got our choice of the best programmers around. And so Ingress was pretty much 3 or 4 undergraduates or grad students who were all fantastic programmers, and we had one full-time staff person. So it was written by 5 people.
And so the prototype's working in 1974, and the traditional academic thing to do would have been write papers and declare victory. What did you do?
That's another sort of incredible piece of serendipity. We had it running. We could write papers, and we had done the first 90% of the work, which is we can make it run. And then, for God knows what reason, we decided to do the next 90% of the work, which is get it so somebody else could make it run.
And you don't really remember what the triggering event was? It the programmers wanted to do it, or you or Gene wanted to do it to make it?
I think
Mike wanted to really make it work.
I guess I haven't thought about this in a long time, so this is just kind of a random thought. So at the time, there was this huge dispute over relational database systems.
Yeah, we talked, RISC versus SIS was a big debate.
Yeah.
Relational database, there was the industrialists who made money. Bachman got a Turing Award for his network model.
Right.
And that was the right way to do it. And, a lot of IBM sales were around their databases, and it's a huge industry. And here's this radical other idea that was supposed to be better and simpler. And, so all the industrialists didn't, it was a crazy idea. Right?
So everybody kept asking us, what's the largest database? What's the largest Ingress database? Who are your customers? And of course, at the beginning, we didn't have any. And so that was, I think, the catalyst to keep going. And
So is the debate?
Make it so somebody else could make
I
our
see.
code run.
I see. So to win this debate, the argument against you, oh, you have a toy system, you don't have any users.
Right.
Oh yeah, we're going to have users.
And so I think that was kind of the catalyst. And so, you know, Ingress had, over the next probably 3 years, a couple hundred users, which forced us to write documentation, forced us to make the code really work, forced us to address performance problems. I mean, the stuff about making it so other people could use it was a huge amount of work. And
It still is.
yeah, that's
It
right.
still is.
Nothing's changed.
And then, but these were like people who used it, people who are already using Unix, or they wanted to get a database system, so they got your system in Unix.
Most of the early users were other universities who at this point had bought into Unix. And, you know, like if you had $100,000 and you wanted modern computing, this was pretty much the only game in town. You figured out how to get a PDP-11, and you ran Unix. And then you looked around and said, hey, there's this thing called Ingress, let's get that. And so at the time, we would send out 9-track tapes to people. That was sort of the early version of SneakerNet. And so lots and lots and lots of people were running Ingress.
So you decide to found your first company, which was originally called Relational Technology, and later called Ingress. I got two questions. The first question: what made you decide to do that?
That one was actually pretty simple. Gene and I ran a couple of short courses at UC Santa Cruz Summer School, you know, for industrial folks.
For a long time, for a decade or two, the Santa Cruz summer school courses were prestige summer school courses. The best faculty teach them. People would come all over to it, and you get to hang out in Santa Cruz. And I don't know why it ended, but it was very, very effective.
So one of the guys who came to this course one year was a guy named, I think, Dave Dunlop. And he was a system programmer for Arizona State University. And he looked at our stuff and said, wow, this is terrific. And so he said, I want to implement the Arizona State University student record system on Ingress. And, you know, all 40,000 students worth. And he could get over the fact that he had to get an unsupported operating system, Unix, from these guys in North Carolina. He could get over that he had to get an unsupported database system from these kooks at Berkeley. But the project went down the drain when he realized there was no COBOL available for Unix, and he was a COBOL shop.
How many people have heard COBOL? Okay, good. Just texting.
and so it was clear that to have an impact, we had to move Ingress to a supported operating system. We had to support Ingress itself, and that required forming a commercial company. And so that was at least my reason. Gene probably has other reasons.
I think the number one reason was that it couldn't continue as a supported system without a lot more funding that we were able to get. I think the sponsors, the government sponsors, didn't want to fund support.
All right, and my second question, and I remember this, is what was it like in those days to compete with Larry Ellison, who founded Oracle about the same time, I assume about the same time he did Ingress?
He was 1 year earlier, and so the first thing is he claimed that Oracle was 10 times faster than Ingress, when in fact Oracle didn't run at all. and so he was the 1970s version of our current president.
The Donald Trump of database technology.
And so, I mean, a bunch of things. Number one is he and Bill Gates are, I think, singularly responsible for giving system software a crummy reputation. Because they would both, Larry Ellison's point of view is we'll release the code and our customers will debug it. and so Microsoft had the same thing, which is it's sort of gotten it quickly got to the point where no one would run system software until it was like 18 months old, and somebody else had sort of gotten all the problems out. And so competing against somebody who lies all the time and who's willing to release crummy software. And one of Larry Ellison's great features is there's a thing in relational databases called referential integrity. And don't worry if you'd never heard of it. So Ingres had it, and Oracle didn't. So what Larry Ellison did was added a manual page to his manual called Referential Integrity, defined all the stuff of what it is, and then at the bottom of the page said future
TBD.
Future
TBD.
feature. and so he's not a nice person at all. And so if you want to read a great book, sort of for bedtime reading, there's a book called The Difference Between God and Larry Ellison. And the subtitle is God Doesn't Think He's Larry Ellison.
No, I remember at the time, you guys, you and Gene and Larry Rowe were, I was complaining bitterly about competing against Larry Ellison. This guy just makes things up, and
where have I seen that recently?
And it was just really hard, but I guess he's a good businessman, I guess, but he's from.
Well, he invented the notion of scorched earth, which is if he thought he was going to lose a deal, then what he would do is cut his price to zero. And the answer was not to get the business. It's just that to deny resources to the opposition.
So that the competition doesn't get a win.
Right. So that they don't get much money out of the deal, even though they win it.
All right, maybe you learned that in business school or something. I don't know. Actually, you open source the code. And besides Ingres, there were other companies that used that code base, right? It was Sybase and others?
Okay, so the University of California version of Ingres, we just sent out tapes to anybody who asked. And because we figured, we were missionaries for relational databases. And so at the time, those open source was a word that didn't exist. And people kept asking us, what are the license terms for using Ingres? And so I can't remember. Anyway, we put a copyright thing on the code that said this is open, this is free to use for anybody to do anything. And so anybody could. So lots of people picked up Ingres and did whatever they did. And I think, when we started a commercial company, they took the open source code and they ran with it. And what they had was not open source.
Afterwards, yeah.
Afterwards.
Actually, I think we got away with it only because Spice did it. Yeah, Don Peterson and Spice.
So Don Peterson, who was a legendary character when Mike and I were young, he, in electrical engineering, had a computer-aided design program to help do circuit evaluation called SPICE. And it was his philosophy that the best thing we could do as a university was to give this away, because we would get a lot, because the alternative would be to license it and sell it. And it was a very valuable program, and it's still used today, believe it or not, 50 years later. but he believed giving it away, we'd get more funding from industry from the relationships that developed in that than if we were to sell it. And so that was his original vision, and you know, we've followed in his path, you know, ever since. So then, after you founded the company, you and Larry Rowe began the post-Ingress effort, which was called Postgres.
Yes.
And what did you do differently, or what was the motivation?
Well, come to my talk this afternoon.
Okay, you can talk about that then. All right, then I'll skip that. All right, then let me say.
But I think the Postgres was, you know, by then, it just seemed natural to do open source software, and so Postgres, in fact, was picked up by a whole bunch of it forms the basis of a whole bunch of commercial database startups. And so, and of course, it's wildly popular today from an open source community picking up our code line and running with it. So I think Postgres has been an incredibly, you know, valuable instance of the way open source ought to work. Okay,
I think I know the answer to my next question, but I found an interview with you in 2002, and they asked you about Ingress versus Postgres. I think that in quoting you, I think that the greatest success was almost certainly Ingress. That certainly had a tremendous impact. It remains to be seen whether Postgres will cross the chasm. This was 2000, so it crossed, right? And so you think Postgres is the greatest impact then?
By far.
By far, okay.
Well, I think if you read my Turing Award citation, it does not talk about Ingress.
Oh, it doesn't talk about it?
No.
Oh, okay. So you founded a company. You founded a few companies at Berkeley.
Yes.
And then it seems like every research project you do at MIT leads to a startup. I don't know if that's actually true, but several.
Yeah. So I've formed nine venture capital backed startups, of which Ingress was the first.
So which do you think which of those has the greatest technological legacy, do you think?
Well, I'd answer that. Well, I think obviously Postgres, because it's probably arguably the most popular open source relational database system on the planet. But I can answer it another way, which is when you commercialize a code line, the question is how much of the original ideas survive after the commercial guys get done doing their thing. And the answer, you know, like Postgres had a ton of interesting stuff in it, but the commercial company threw most of it out. The one that had the most number of ideas that survived intact was probably Vertica and CStore.
Mm-hmm. It's a vertically integrated,
so it's a column store database system. So I think of the stuff that was in the academic prototype that actually survived, that may have been the most successful initial design.
And what about financially? Is one of them the most obviously successful, or too early to tell?
I mean, who made me the most money?
Well, you could do it that way, or the biggest company or something like that.
Vertica.
Vertica. Okay. And I'm going to open up to the audience, but what do you think about data science? I know Mike Franklin thinks that it's going to be like a separate field like computer science and maybe the same size. What do you think?
Okay, so I have two things to say. Number one, here's a real vignette from the main machine learning data scientist at a company called iRobot, which makes the self-driving vacuum cleaners. Yeah. So she said, and her job is data scientist. So she said, I spend 90% of my time finding, integrating, and cleaning the data sources that I want to analyze, 90%. And then she said, that leaves 10% to do data science. Of the remaining 10%, she said, 90% of that is cleaning the errors in the original cleaning. So she spends 99% of her time on what we would all call data integration, and 1% on data science. So the answer is the high poll in the 10, and I've never heard anybody claim less than 80% is spent on data preparation. So the answer is data science is not about data science, or it shouldn't be. It should be about data integration. So that's the high pole in the tent. Number two, if you look at data science, there are thousands of people attempting to do research on machine learning and AI. And so we have a fixation. We have a fixation on deep learning. We have a fixation on ML in general. And it's a very, very crowded research space. So if you wanted to make a difference in data science, look at the high pole in the tent, which is how are you going to apply AI and ML to doing data integration? So to me, that's the important problem, because you should look for where the pain is of people who are actually doing this for a living.
And it's also a good idea to do something a little contrarian that everybody else isn't working on.
Absolutely. If you want to get tenure at a university, being a contrarian, I think, is a great idea. You know, the gentleman beside me is famous for RISC, which was a revolutionary idea at the time. So, good thing it worked out.
Yeah, good thing it worked out. For both of us. Fist bump. Okay. All right. How about I open up the floor to... Oh, good. We already got a question. Is there a microphone or... Okay, I'll repeat it. What's the most interesting Halloween experience? Today's Halloween. I don't. You got to answer that one.
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Yeah, he didn't get to go to Halloween.
Actually, since I was an undergraduate at Princeton, as you heard before, Princeton makes a huge deal of alumni reunions, and so every class has this outfit that you wear during reunions, and they're all orange and black because Princeton is
Princeton's
the
colors.
Tigers. So I have an orange and black tuxedo, which I sometimes wear at Halloween.
All right, good answer. All right, other questions? Other questions? Okay.
So you said that the work you did at Berkeley, most of it was open sourced, even after it left academia. Did that continue after you went to MIT, or is the culture there a little different?
I think Berkeley and MIT are exactly the same, and everything is open source. So I think all systems work at MIT is open source, and I think all systems work here is pretty much open source. And so I think, to me, that's the right model.
Speaking about MIT and Berkeley, I did that same interview in 2002. You just gotten to MIT, and you commented upon how you were at Berkeley. You formed groups of other faculty, and you just worked together in teams. And it didn't look like that was the culture at MIT at the time. Do you remember that?
No, but but you've got to remember that MIT at the time had no one in databases, no classes, no professors, no nothing. So then there was me, and so I'm all alone, and so I of course would feel that way because there was no one to collaborate with, and so in the beginning, I went around to Brown and Brandeis and the other schools in the area, and collectively we formed an extended research group.
I see, to find out people to collaborate with.
And then, of course, over time, MIT built into a lot of database folks.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I think during recruiting visits for incoming graduate students, I think Berkeley and MIT are most similar in the way they think about things.
How about other questions here? Okay.
How was entrepreneurship different from the 80s?
Okay. How is starting a company different now than it was in the 1980s?
Okay. Well, I think let's start with Ingress, because that was in 1980, and so recruiting venture capitalist backing. The first thing the VCs all said was, well, if this stuff is such a great idea, why won't the big players have it next week? And so you had to convince them that writing software was hard. And so by and large, the VCs at the time were used to backing companies to build the next generation of disk drives. And so a software, a VC-backed software company was very different at the time. Now everybody's in software, and it's way easier to raise money. It also helps if you've done it. The VCs, to me, are like lemmings, which is if you haven't done it before, then you probably can't do it. And so if you have done it before, whether or not you have a good idea, you probably will be successful. So for me, raising money now is very easy, and because the VCs sort of view past successes as predictors of the future.
Did at the time in 1980 was startups coming out of universities, was that rare too, or was that commonplace?
Very rare.
So you had to talk them into the idea that academics could do something that lead to a company.
I mean, that was another thing that they said, well, if this is such a great idea, why don't you resign from the university and do this full time? And that was, and I guess the answer is that Ingress was very, very unusual in multiple dimensions. And I think that kind of was probably responsible for us getting crummy pricing relative to what came later.
Oh, you mean how much money you could raise and how much of the company had to give up to get the money? I see.
Right.
All right. Other questions? So how about the one thing that led to this thing was this kind of remarkable, why did all these Turing projects happen at Berkeley? And so that's what started this. I think and I was thinking, being close to Silicon Valley clearly affected me and you. I think Velvel Khan was that. Do you have any other thoughts about this? How did this happen? Because at the time, we talked last week, there were two departments on campus, and they were just forced to work together. There was a lot of stuff that could have been upsetting or could have detracted from the research, but it didn't.
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is Berkeley gave me tenure based on a publication record that was a bunch of, we built this stuff and it turned out to work. And I had written no theory papers. And yet Berkeley still gave me tenure. And I think, the tradition got going from the administration being willing to give tenure to candidates who didn't look like the traditional mold.
Yeah, I think so too. I saw Ousterhout recently we still go to Cal football games together, and he said, Silicon Valley applies to Stanford, but Stanford turned, a Berkeley campus philosophy is to hire great young people and nurture them. That's a camp. I thought it was the EECS, but it's a campus or college. It's a campus philosophy. Stanford had 3 assistant professors who eventually won Turing Awards that didn't become associate professors. We talked last week about how in the math department turned down Steve Cook, who later came up with the idea that led to the Turing Prize. And what a disaster that was, but it wasn't us. You know, had Stanford kept Nicholas Wirth and Raj Reddy and Vint Cerf, you know, they would have had 3 more. So I think Berkeley was a very welcoming place for young faculty and, you know, helping them succeed. And, you know, we're kind of a young person's field. So I think that was, you know, so I think Silicon Valley, young person's field, and kind of the Berkeley policy. In fact, when I was visiting Franklin at University of Chicago, and he said, what's the secret of Berkeley? You know, I just had people coming through and saying, oh, how screwed up Berkeley is, you know, with the finances and all that stuff. And he said, but they've been saying that same thing about Berkeley for decades. And with you know, in the 80s, Berkeley's all screwed up. So how can it be so successful and so screwed up? And
but I think there's a really simple answer to that, which is, if you look at 1985, so Berkeley had done Ingress, it had done Berkeley Unix, and it had done Maxima, and so there were a whole bunch of big systems projects that Berkeley did that all worked and had dramatic impact. And so I think, you know, Berkeley's sort of influence, you know, probably happened from these early projects, because that begat hiring more people, you know, like those.
Okay. Any other questions? Chance? All right, I think, well, thank Mike for a great discussion. I'm looking forward to this afternoon.